and its potential impact. We're joined by Mark Cancian, Senior Advisor of International Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Mark, thank you very much for joining us. How damaging is this to the Ukraine war effort, first of all?
Well, there's no question that it's embarrassing. There's a lot of very candid information in there that's embarrassing not just to Ukraine, but to other allies, Egypt, South Korea, Israel. There aren't any smoking guns, though. There's nothing in there that hasn't already been commented on in the open press, so it's not as if there is new information. What is embarrassing, though, is that it's coming from the United States government, particularly at a time when the United States government is trying to portray a solidarity with the Ukrainians and a lot of optimism about their future.
Right. Does it really impact the spring offensive that we are going to see in Ukraine now? Russia has promised to step up attacks. Ukraine is also gathering support from allies with ammunition and weapon systems to fight back. Do you think this will hamper Ukraine's ability to fight back?
I don't think so. Ukraine's ability to fight back is going to be driven by three things. First, it's the weapons and munitions that the United States and others are sending to Ukraine, and that's not going to be slowed down at all. In fact, that flow is continuing. It's also going to be affected by the training that the Ukrainians are receiving from NATO and the United States, and that's continuing also. And finally, by the determination of the Ukrainian people, which is not affected. So it's not going to have an effect on the Ukrainian counteroffensive. The Russians, of course, complain and say that they'll launch attacks, but they're already doing that to their maximum ability. They're going to go over to the defensives shortly when the Ukrainians launch their offensive.
Right. The other point, as far as U.S. intelligence gathering abilities go, there have been reports about how the satellite information gathering capabilities of the United States have been revealed through these documents. Do you think there is any kind of specific, very classified information which is now out in public domain, which may impact the United States?
The short answer is not very much. The documents are classified as secret and top secret, but that does not include how they got the information. People have looked at them and inferred how we might have got that information maybe from satellites, but our capabilities there are well known. A lot of it probably comes from electronic surveillance. And of course, there's been harassment of U.S. spy planes out in the Black Sea. So that's not really news either to the Russians. So the bottom line is, I don't think that sources and methods were really endangered.
At this juncture, the U.S. Justice Department is carrying out an inquiry into how this happened, Mark. How do you think this is going to proceed, and what all will the U.S. government be looking at? All this came out on an online platform called Discord. There is some amount of information available about the user who had posted these documents, this package of documents. What do we know so far, and what will the U.S. government now do?
Well, starting with what the U.S. government will do, it's going to restrict the number of people who can see this information. That's going to make it a little harder for decision-making, but this has been very embarrassing, and clearly current procedures are inadequate. In terms of who did it, there's a lot of information out there about the person. It looks like it was the information was posted on a gaming website because of gaming interests, and there was just a lot of other information. So that the U.S. government is going to find out who this person was and why they did it. That'll tell us whether this person was a foreign agent, was a Russian spy, or whether this was just a young person who foolishly took some documents because of their interest in online gaming.
Right. As far as the U.S. Relationship with some of its closest allies, do you think there will be some questions raised?
Well, the biggest question comes up with Ukraine, because a couple of the revelations in the documents are, again, not really news, but are embarrassing. One of them is that the Ukrainians are running out of anti-aircraft missiles, and that could cause a problem. The other one is that the United States is less optimistic about how successful the counteroffensive will be than maybe the Ukrainians and maybe other commentators. It believes the United States that there will be modest territorial gains. I think that's probably realistic given where we are. But again, Ukraine believes it's going to be much more successful. There are embarrassing revelations about the Egyptians, for example. And I think we're going to have harsh words for the Egyptians because it's reported that they were going to sell missiles to Russia. There's some embarrassment with the South Koreans about providing our artillery, but that had all been in the open press.
Right. There were also reports how there were around 97 special forces personnel from NATO countries who were involved in Ukraine, how the UK special forces had trained the Ukraine military as well. Do you think this could be a factor that Russia will now keep in mind? Do you think this is something that could hamper further training, further support from NATO allies to Ukraine?
Well, that was a piece of news that was not known before. There had been suspicions that there might be special forces in Ukraine. This seems to confirm that there were at least small numbers helping to train the Ukrainians. The Russians will certainly point out that these are boots on the ground, that NATO is now actively participating in the war. I suspect that the United States and NATO may pull some of these troops back. Keep in mind, though, that almost all of the training is done in Europe. That is in Germany and Poland and the United Kingdom. So it won't affect most of the training, but it will affect some.
Right. Now, coming to our final set of questions, Mark, as far as the US government goes, do you think there has been a certain lapse, certain gaps on its front as far as the presence of this information in social media goes? According to the Times, this was reported on the 5th of April, but it is widely believed that it had been on the Discord platform for at least a month. And according to some reports, all this information was already available since January.
Yes, that's very embarrassing and constitutes a very serious security leak, really the most serious since the early 2000s in the Bradley Manning document leaks. First, how this person got a hold of these documents and was able to photograph them. That should not be able to happen. And then posting them online with no one noticing, again, very surprising. So yes, a major security breach that the Pentagon is going to work hard to close.
Right. Any steps that the West will have to watch out for, which Russia could take now as a result of this information that has been gathered?
There's not really very much that Russia can do. They're already doing everything they can. They've mobilized their forces. They've gone on the offensive. They've launched attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. I think you'll see some changes in their propaganda, pointing out that NATO is on the ground, claiming that NATO is now a combatant. But in terms of what they do, I don't think there's really much more they can do. Their greatest challenge is coming up. That is, when the Ukrainians go with the offensive, can the Russians hold or will they break?
And finally, Mark, what will be the next phase of support that you think the US would have to lend Ukraine? How will they now have to support Ukraine in the war effort, considering that we're not seeing any kind of solution in sight as of now?
Well, the success of the Ukrainian offensive will be critical. If the Ukrainians can show real progress on the ground, even if they don't clear all of their occupied territory, but if they can show, for example, as they did last fall, that they can launch successful offensives and to retake territory, I think that will encourage supporters in the United States and NATO. The great fear in the United States and NATO is that this is a forever war, will go on for many years without resolution. So if the Ukrainians can have some success, I think that the support from the West will continue. On the other hand, if the Ukrainians fail, then this concern about a forever war will become more prominent, and there may be more pushes for a negotiated settlement, which means a settlement in place, leaving the Russians with the territory they've occupied.
All right, Mark Cancian, thank you so much for joining us with your perspective on the intelligence leaks on the Ukraine war, how this could impact or how this may not at all impact the US effort to support Ukraine in this war. So let's see how things pan out in the days to come as far as this investigation goes. Let's shift our focus to the Taiwan Strait. Yes, tensions have been peaking after China's recent military drills that involved aerial and naval blockades near Taiwan. In the latest development, China has released a fresh set of revised rules for military recruitment in wartime, which are set to come into effect next month. The move is being analyzed as a reflection of China's seriousness to be able to ward off Taiwan in a conflict. This comes after Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen met with US House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California, sparking condemnation from China. And joining me now to take this forward is Brahma Chalani, strategic affairs expert. Mr. Chalani, thank you so much for being with us. 3 days of intensive simulations around the Taiwanese Strait. How serious is this? How different is this from previous military drills carried out by China?
The first thing to remember is that Chinese military drills are really empty shows of force. The present China-India military standoff is a consequence of how China's unusually large winter exercises on the Tibetan Plateau in early 2020 became the launchpad for China's stealthy land grabs in Ladakh. And this has triggered this continuing military confrontation between India and China. So given what China is doing against Taiwan, we should not underestimate China's designs against Taiwan. What we saw over the last 3 days was a repeat of what happened in August last year when China conducted military drills right around Taiwan. These live-fire military drills around Taiwan effectively simulate an air and sea blockade. So this really gives you an idea as to how Xi Jinping will launch his aggression against Taiwan. It will begin with an air and sea blockade of Taiwan.
Do you think there is a possibility of an invasion, a blockade, or even a quarantine over Taiwan? Shipping activities have been restricted. Earlier, there were some reports of China wanting to impose a no-fly zone over Taiwan.
Unlike the Russian style of aggression, which is, full-fledged aggression, or the American style of aggression that we saw against Iraq or, against Libya or other places, the Chinese style of aggression, after the disastrous Chinese invasion of Vietnam in 1979, the Chinese style is incremental aggression. We've seen that in the South China Sea, how they've changed the entire map of South China Sea without firing a single shot. And we saw that in Ladakh, how they changed the territorial status quo without firing a single shot. So against Taiwan, it won't be a full-fledged aggression. It will begin with an air and sea blockade. And the drills that we have seen in recent days allowed Chinese troops to practice enforcing a quarantine around Taiwan that would result in Taiwan's gradual economic strangulation. So it'll be a strategy of calibrated squeeze to force Taiwan to unify with China.
Mr. Chalani, do you think this will also test the U.S. leadership in the region at a time when U.S. leadership, U.S.'s status as a superpower is at test in the Ukraine-Russia war? What happens with Taiwan? And if China is able to impose that blockade or quarantine, and that continues for a few months, do you think that will test U.S. dominance in the region and U.S. role in the region as well?
You're absolutely right. In fact, it's a very good question. If Taiwan were to fall to China, it would significantly advance China's hegemonic ambitions in Asia and upend the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region, not least by enabling China to break out of the so-called first island chain. But more importantly, it will mark the end of America's global preeminence. this will be the final nail in the coffin of America's global preeminence. And yet, ironically, as many American analysts are pointing out, the Biden administration is more focused on helping Ukraine fight Russia rather than deterring China's aggression against Taiwan. Even though the future of American power rests on Taiwan's autonomous status being safeguarded. But there are also important implications for India. If Taiwan falls, the next territory China is likely to covet and target is the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. Arunachal is 3 times bigger than Taiwan, and in the name of quote-unquote reunification, China will begin targeting India's Arunachal Pradesh. So India too has a stake in the present status quo in relation to Taiwan. If that status quo is disturbed, it'll have a significant bearing on Asian security, on American security, and on Indian security.
Right. What I would also like to ask you, what is India's policy vis-a-vis Taiwan right now, Mr. Chilane? We have been seeing that for some time in bilateral conversations, India has not been clearly spelling out the one China principle as China wants it. Do you think there is any kind of change in India's strategy vis-a-vis Taiwan? What are our cultural relations or democratic relations with Taiwan as of now?
Well, given China's designs on Taiwan and also China's designs on Arunachal Pradesh, that we have, in recent days, we have seen how China has stepped up its renaming of places within Indian control. So given those realities, it's become imperative for India to hold consultations with like-minded powers, including Japan, Australia, and the United States, as to how each nation can contribute to Taiwan's security. Of course, America's role is central to Taiwan's autonomous future. A U.S. that fails to prevent Taiwan's subjugation would be widely seen as unable or unwilling to defend any other ally. So the status quo on Taiwan is more likely to be preserved if the U.S. coordinates its Taiwan defense plans with India, Japan, and Australia, including how to respond to potential Chinese moves to restrict access to Taiwan, whether physically or digitally. I think the only thing that can deter China from aggression against Taiwan is the expectation that it would incur high concrete costs. That is the only thing that can deter China.
Right. My final set of questions, Mr. Chilane. Now, as far as the situation with the drills go, do you think Taiwan has the wherewithal to probably make sure that there is no blockade, no quarantine? And if this blockade happens, if this quarantine happens, how different is it from a full-blown invasion? And what are the consequences?
A full-blown invasion would mean that Chinese troops would cross the strait and land on Taiwanese territory. Defense is always easier than offense. Taiwan can wait for such a Chinese invasion and give the invading Chinese forces a bloody nose. But that's not going to be the Chinese way of attacking Taiwan. The Chinese way of attacking Taiwan would be to impose an aerial and sea blockade. To prevent such a blockade, Taiwan by itself doesn't have that capability to prevent China from enforcing a quarantine. So that's where the American role becomes so critical. And once Xi Jinping begins his strategy of slowly strangulating Taiwan, what I call the slow squeeze, once the slow squeeze begins, at what time the US will say this is an act of war, that merits America's direct involvement. That will then determine Taiwan's future. If the Americans wait too long, then Taiwan will have no capacity to withstand this kind of indirect attack on its sovereignty and integrity. The fact is the Taiwanese government has disclosed in recent weeks that Taiwan only has 11 days of gas reserves. So here is a vibrant island democracy, which is also a very wealthy economy, which is very heavily dependent on energy imports, whose reserves will last only some days. And once the Chinese enforce a blockade of Taiwan, the Taiwanese economy will begin to collapse. That's the reason why the Biden administration must take the Chinese threat very seriously. These latest exercises are a reminder to Washington that the Chinese aggression against Taiwan may come sooner than many in Washington expect.
Right. Mr. Chennai, thank you so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you here on Global Eye. Clearly, what's happening between Taiwan and China is something that India needs to watch out very clearly, and a blockade or even a quarantine will have consequences if it continues for even 4 to 5 months for that matter. Thank you once again for being with us. That's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.